There is another strain of gendered analysis which is far less theoretically problematic than other aspects brought forth in this series, but which is fairly limited in its usefulness in terms of gendered equity, and potentially quite awful in its practical applications. This is the concern of political power, who holds what political roles, when and how. As noted earlier in this series, in terms of royalty and aristocracies, which encompasses the vast majority of the human species' history of political power, power was broadly shared via the reality of the importance of familial relations, influences of families upon each other, etc. While the nominal leader did tend to be male, it was the familial units as a whole who actually wielded power. There is definitely room therein to quibble about who held which reins of power, however, such is mostly of historical note, and not particularly enlightening regarding the lives of people in general. Politics is mostly bullshitting anyway, and most of it doesn't really impact the lives of the overwhelming majority of people. What is useful therein to note, however, within the current politic is just how far familial units continue to control the reins of power. Even within a democracy, while it is true that the office holder technically has the right to make decisions for the imaginary political construct, it is also true that the office holders' families and their various familial relations actually all hold the reins of power. As in, those people close to the office holder have massive influences upon the office holder. Not to focus too much on the historical narrative, but the same power dynamics held within the democracies from the get-go, when women were not allowed to actually hold the offices of power. Folks in the broader social justice analysis are quick to point out how much power lobbyists have, and they are not wrong in doing so, but then they are just as quick to dismiss the power that the familial relations actually always had. That said, this is definitely not an argument to somehow claim that women, men or anyone for that matter, ought not be allowed to hold the offices of political power. Insofar as we have these, they definitely ought be inclusive to all peoples. The above is far more to point out the political reality, the imagery therein, and the broad gender equitability that has always been in place, relative to the time, culture and place. That is, to dismantle the anachronistic gendered analysis as it relates to the political in particular. It is worthwhile to give a very brief accounting on the history of democracy. Despite the narratives in the current, democracy and democratic principles are neither obviously nor inherently correct. Folks might think I am undemocratic for saying such. I am not. I am very much pro-democracy. My point though is that there is nothing about democratic principles that even remotely suggests that they are obvious or correct. This is fairly important for understanding human history in general, and democratic history in particular. There are and always have been good reasons to be highly distrustful of democratic processes, to in short and in sum, prefer to listen to the experts, the leading figures, the smarty pantses, and so forth. We do this to this day, and in many ways the Internet displays this point to us rather forcefully so as to why the limiting of who we really listen to matters. The point here, especially as it relates to something like public education and the modern realities of multicultural and city life, is that there has long been reason to be suspicious of simply granting the plebs political power via democracy. Having folks who are, in essence, fools about issues which have effective force on masses of people, have any particular say on what ought be done is, well, Susie, to put it mildly. It is very strongly akin to suggesting that someone who has no education in the matters of medicine ought be given equal weight of consideration regarding matters of medicine. I mention this not to make an argument against democracy, but rather to seriously temper the fervor of anachronistic ideological bullshitting takes in the current regarding the history of democracy. Modern democracies didn't spring forth from the ground fully formed, fully enfranchised, nor out of a cultural context of peace, love and understanding. Literally or practically every single nation on earth practiced slavery when the modern, democratic experiment took shape. There was very little public education, and even literacy rates tended to be quite low, even in places where they were relatively high globally speaking. Moreover, access to that education and literacy was limited via race, class, and gender. This was true everywhere, and the races, classes, and gender limitations varied by location. The notion, to be super blunt about it, that an uneducated pleb ought have a say in matters of state is rather strikingly prescient of the problems in the current. See the horrors of the internets, and the lunatic states that people are in more generally. Democracy doesn't work sans education, and anything like public education or even literacy as a meaningful skill for folks in general to have is simply new. Not only that, but those aspects like public education and the importance of literacy evolve from democracies. One doesn't have them and then do democracy. One forces democracies and thereby sets the stage for their development. There are reasons why, in other words, real rationales as to why it is that democracy didn't simply open with all peoples being enfranchised. One doesn't have to resort to claims of inherent sexism or inherent racism, or more broadly claims that the past primitive peoples were brutish, cruel and dumb. Any of these things could be true, don't get me wrong. But the point is that such needn't really be the case to explain the whys as to why it was that democracies have tended to be only incrementally enfranchising of people. Folks looking upon the past, upon the inceptions of democracies, are not wrong to note that there was racism and sexism involved. Of the former there was like Mississippi goddamn, levels of racism involved. There was strange fruit levels of racism involved. Where they might be wrong though is in assuming that racism or sexism were the main or only real justifying reason associated with the limited enfranchisement. In other words, the rationale that was oft used wasn't because they are women or because they aren't white. The rationale tended to be because they are uneducated or because they aren't free or because they don't own land. Each of which as a reason not entirely coincidentally also entailed that women, the poor, and non-whites couldn't vote. At least that was the case in the inception of American democracies. But I want to be clear on this point as it is critical for folks to understand those rationales are valid regardless of to whom we are speaking of. They predate the current inception of democracies, and they varied from location to location as to whom they have been applied. Noting that variation in their practical structure is important as it entails that race, class, and gender were not the overriding rationales involved in such exclusions. Different places excluded differently, oft enough along racial, class and gendered grounds, but the exclusions followed a principle regarding educational concerns, the concerns of the expertise of people in general. That those concerns oft enough followed racial, class, and gendered grounds says something about the existing state that the democracies were founded within, rather than anything in particular about the principles the founding followed. This is borne out too in the relevant written records. That is, the folks that founded democracies, the argumentation they utilized, the rationales they utilized, are actually these, at least according to them. Again, they utilized these rationales in the context of "go tell it on the mountain" levels of racism. Hence, uneducated also entailed "no blacks allowed" for reasons of racism. But the rationale was ultimately lack of education, not racism. It is perhaps fruitful in not so strange a way for folks to note W.E.B. Du Bois' concern in regards to the freed slaves, how worrisome their state was in economics and democracies, that they lacked education. That sentiment was broadly shared by abolitionists at the time, as just this really awful pragmatic reality that has to be dealt with. These are rather difficult sorts of things for folks in the current to really recognize, I think, because they are lacking in the imaginative capacity to place themselves within the context of the times. Imagine, as I am sure we all can, that one time, or the many times, you've talked with someone whereby no matter how long you speak to them about something, no matter all the facts, figures, formulas, and logic you avail yourself of, they retort with something utterly inane, possibly insane, definitely wrong, and there is just nothing you can do short of not bother listening to them anymore in order to handle the situation. Imagine, in other words, you live in a society where slavery was an accepted norm, where basically no one was educated, and few people could even read, where what constituted education was fairly limited, where racism was a norm of thinking, where sexism was hardly even given a second thought. That is the position the early democracies were in, and oft enough in the current still are today in various places around the world. Even if you were an utterly benevolent actor in such a situation, what might you really do as a matter of pragmatics of what was even realistically plausible to do in that kind of situation? And let's be clear, the folks putting it together were not utterly benevolent actors. The point of this brief history of democracies is to denote the anachronistic history in the current, whereby it is held something like women were oppressed. See, look at the history of democracy. Women couldn't even vote. No one could vote. Every inch of the fight for democracies entailed folks fighting for their rights to vote. And the reasons why didn't really have much of anything to do with sexism. Among the issues this particular anachronistic analysis is causing in the current is a tendency to think that the solutions to social justice issues, especially as they relate to gendered social justice issues, is or ought be political in form. In regards to social justice as it relates to politics, what this piece is attempting to do is first deflate the imagery of politics as meaningful seats of power for the lives of actual people, and to then denote that a legitimate path towards gendered equitability is ultimately subversive to these national and economic unicorns. Insofar as the gendered social justice movement is concerned with political power, it is fairly short-lived and the solutions are straightforward: allow all people the capacity to hold the various offices. This is something that is not meaningfully in question anymore, in no small part thanks to effective birth control, public education, and the activists that push the issues. There are almost certainly going to be legacy systems, as in, traditional familial units of power, and difficulties therein in actually achieving something like a gendered equitability. However, especially in regards to women, such are little more than legacy issues and they will fade as time goes on. Providing of course that folks continue to do the relevant work, actively participate in the relevant systems, etc. It is important to note how recent that movement really is, how the cultural attitudes have shifted. Few are those who actually hold that women ought not hold positions of political offices. As I read the actual politic, the biggest stumbling block to reaching something like a gendered equitability in distribution of political offices has far more to do with the political fact that incumbents are simply difficult to remove from office, and historically men have in fact held those offices. There are no serious political movements to keep women out of office, in other words, just slow politics. What is incredibly dangerous for the gendered social justice movements, and more broadly of social justice movements in general, is to mistake the politic or the economic as the meaningful goal or seat of power. It is not, it never has been, and it never will be. Ultimately, such positions of power apply directly to the lives of a vanishingly small minority of people. It is true that indirectly they may apply to the lives of vast swaths of people, but not only historically, but also in the current times. Those effects are actually rather small in terms of the day-to-day lives of people. In American politics in particular, government control is generally understood to be abhorrent. This isn't to say that national politics doesn't have some place, but by and large, life is lived locally, and national politics plays little part in the lives of people. There are of course exceptions, and there are, perhaps, things worth fighting over in the national politic, insofar as we want a national politic. Beyond the rather simplistic, yet valid, concern that all positions of political power ought be available to everyone, the concerns of power become those of concerns about power grabbing. Power grabbing can have many significant undesirable consequences, such as alienation of people, erosion of ethical standards and norms, etc. To raise oneself up on a political pedestal under the guise of advocating for some sort of gendered reform carries with it the not inconsiderable risks of creating boogeymen, demonizing people based on their gender or sexuality, and so forth. All of which not coincidentally we see in the currents, due exactly to this kind of political power grabbing. This is true regardless of the efficacy of the claims. It is simply more egregious when there is a lacking in the efficacy of the claims. There is likewise rather serious colonialistic concerns in this matter, that is, the raising up of some particular view of gender and sexuality at the expense of all others. By holding some particular view to political power, one is thereby diminishing the realities of others. This particular salient point is covered a great deal in this series, as it amounts to among the most egregious aspects of the gendered reformers in the current, and plays itself out in a myriad of ways. But among the most critical points to understand as this situation relates specifically to concerns about the obtaining of a gendered equitable form are that folks' political power grabbing are simply missing the mark. They aren't even aiming at the right kind of structures. They're inherently impotent in their petty quests for political power in the name of gendered equitability. Power, that is, day to day, week to week, month to month, and year to year power resides primarily within the familial forms and the local communities within and through which the familial forms live and create. If the focus is upon political power, the actual lives of people, and hence the actual reality of equitability of gendered form are simply not even being aimed at. Which ought be understood as a serious problem, insofar as folks are taking the politics seriously. Which, to be clear, they really ought not be taking the politics seriously. Nor is this to necessarily suggest, and indeed, hopefully to avoid this, that the personal is political, or that folks ought to take the fight into the home. Such is to strongly suggest that the reality of living entails far less divisive kinds of things than what the politic or the economic seem to suggest they do. In the pragmatics beyond the mere familial form, such valid kinds of concern likely amount to the previously alluded to claim and point. All such positions ought be available to folks from any sex/gender, also race, etc. But the main point of this series is about gender winky face. The pragmatics of living entail really just the naked realities of what life is like within the familial form. When the focus isn't there, beyond the aforementioned valid concerns, such amounts to concerns about power grabbing, and such concerns are not particularly important to the relevant questions. Perhaps worse still, such power grabbing can mask itself in the concerns of gendered equality, gendered equitability of form, and yet ultimately be detrimental to any such effort. Not even as it relates to whatever the political concerns may be, but rather, because by doing so people's lives in the familial form become damaged, and that is where their lives are lived. It is, to be blunt about it, to focus on the unicorn culture, rather than the familial form, or the pragmatics of living. In this regard, we ought note that such is true regardless of what sex we are referring. There isn't anything particularly special about either sex in that regard. The question and problem here really amounts to if it is wise or worthwhile for a gendered equitable form to be formalized via politics beyond the everyone has access to the political seats of power. Is politics even the proper venue for such things, and ultimately, is it even really effective or indeed ethically sound to try and do so? How can I put this gently? Gendered relations are culturally defined goods and bads. They are broadly aesthetical sorts of concerns. As other pieces in this series will delve into, many of the issues are broadly but not entirely merely cultural artifacts. What constitutes sound gendered relations, in other words, is something that is determined via the actual lives of people interacting, whereby the cultural norms are crafted. There are exceptions to this, but a vast swath of gendered issues are merely thus. There is serious cause for serious concern that to make an overarching law to enforce and regulate such things is a big bang. The kind of colonialistic cause for concern, whereby whole cultures are eradicated by law, via criminalizing various cultural behaviors. When I look at, for instance, laws that criminalize the way people dress, whereby they go to jail over the clothes they wear, I see an example of gendered cultural violence. Likewise, when I look at laws that criminalize human touch, I see the same. In each of these there are big bads happening, because in each of these there is merely some aesthetic of gendered form that is being referred to, which amounts to a cultural expression, and there is nothing more to it than that. To turn it into a law is to criminalize all other cultural expressions, all other gendered norms of behavior. It is little more than political power grabbing. A whipping up into a fury the masses of people by singling out some bad man over there doing all the bad things. The real seat of power, without the scare quotes on such matters, lay within the hearts of the folks doing the things. They are fluid in their formal structure, maybe especially so in the currents whereby different cultures and hence two differing genders come to interact, make love, make and raise families together, and so forth. How that actually plays out, what are the ethics of that is what is important. Not the ethics of politics. To push the politic into the home, to make the personal political, that is a political power grab, the big baddies. Shall we fight over such things with winners and losers? What horrors y'all want to bring into the world?
你12是妹。